Footsteps on the stairwell below. 2 floors, down, maybe 3. You count them without meaning to. Heavy boots, evenly spaced, moving with the kind of confidence that only exists when the person wearing them knows nobody in this building is going to stop them. You have 90 seconds, maybe less. The wedding ring goes into the loaf of bread on the counter. 3 gold coins go under the loose floorboard beneath the stove, the one your husband pried up and reset himself 6 months ago, just in case. The real papers, the ones with your actual names on them, go into the lining of a coat hanging by the door like it's nothing. Then you sit down at the table and you wait for the knock. This is not a reenactment. This happened in exactly this shape in thousands of apartments across Nazi-occupied Europe, and the families who kept even a fraction of what they owned did it using methods so quiet, so precisely engineered under terror that some of what they invented is still baked into how wealth gets protected today. Really, this is about what people are capable of when the alternative is losing everything, and possibly their lives, to a system built to make sure they had no warning at all. Let's start with why anyone needed to hide anything in the first place.
In 1933, when the Nazi Party took power in Germany, Jewish families didn't wake up one day and lose everything at once. It happened in stages, on purpose, each one designed to look almost reasonable compared to the one before it. First came laws restricting which professions Jewish citizens could work in. Then laws stripping citizenship itself under the Nuremberg laws of 1935. Then, if you tried to leave the country while you still could, the government hit you with something called the Reichsfluchtsteuer, a flight tax that could claw back a quarter or more of everything you owned purely for the crime of trying to escape with it. Leaving safely was taxed like a luxury. By November 1938, after a night of coordinated violence against Jewish communities that came to be known as Kristallnacht, the German government didn't even bother with the pretense of a tax. It imposed a direct one-time seizure, a so-called atonement fine, and made Jewish citizens pay roughly 1 billion Reichsmarks for damage the state itself had ordered against their own communities. So by the time deportations began in earnest, hiding what you had wasn't paranoia, it was arithmetic. Every possession you couldn't account for was one less thing standing between your family and starvation, one more thing you might trade for a forged document, a border crossing, a hiding place for your children. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The people who hid wealth successfully weren't doing anything exotic. They were using the most boring, overlooked objects in the room. Loaves of bread, jars of jam sealed and shelved like nothing was inside, hollowed-out books, spines intact, pages carved into a cavity just deep enough for a ring or a folded banknote, chandeliers with jewels wired into the crystal, indistinguishable from decoration unless you knew exactly where to look. False bottoms built into drawers, trunks, and suitcases, constructed by ordinary carpenters who would never tell anyone what they'd been asked to build. Families sending children abroad on the Kindertransport, the organized rescue effort that moved thousands of Jewish children out of Nazi territory before the war fully closed in, often sewed small valuables directly into the children's coats, not because it was clever, because it might be the only inheritance those children would ever receive, and it had to survive a border inspection performed by people who had every incentive to find it.
Here's where it gets interesting in a colder way. Some families didn't hide their wealth. They handed it to someone else on paper while keeping the real benefit for themselves. It's the same principle behind the medieval trick English landowners used centuries earlier to survive kings who could seize property on a whim. Transfer the legal ownership, keep the actual use.
In Nazi Germany, this took the form of what the regime itself called Aryanization, the forced transfer of Jewish-owned businesses and property to non-Jewish ownership, almost always at a fraction of true value. Officially, this was theft with a legal stamp on it. But some non-Jewish business partners, neighbors, and friends used the same mechanism the regime had built for looting and quietly turned it into a lifeline instead. A shop would be transferred to a trusted non-Jewish associate on paper. The original owner kept working there, kept drawing an income from it, and the real value kept flowing back to their family, all while the storefront legally belonged to someone the state had no reason to investigate. It didn't always work. Plenty of these trustees, once handed the keys, simply kept everything and never gave it back. But some didn't. Some held that business, that apartment, that inventory for years at real personal risk and returned it, or what was left of it, to families who came looking after the war. Then there's the version of this story that involves banks, and it's messier than people assume.
Wealthy families with connections abroad, particularly in the years before the war fully closed borders, moved money into Swiss numbered accounts, protected by strict secrecy laws that asked no questions about who the money belonged to or why. On paper, this looks like the cleanest solution of all. Move the wealth somewhere the Gestapo simply cannot reach it. But the story doesn't end there, and it doesn't end well for everyone. Decades later, in the 1990s, an international investigation forced Swiss banks to admit something uncomfortable. Thousands of accounts opened by Jewish families before and during the war had simply sat there, untouched for 50 years. Not because the banks were protecting them, because the account holders had died in the camps, and the families who might have claimed the money either didn't know the accounts existed or ran into banks that demanded death certificates the Nazi regime had deliberately never issued. It took a class action settlement of over $1 billion, reached in 1998, just to begin returning a fraction of what was owed. The money survived. The people who hid it, in a horrifying number of cases, did not. And that's what separates this from anything clever or admirable. For every family that successfully protected a fortune, there was a darker mechanism running underneath the whole system, one that made hiding anything even more dangerous than it already sounds. Informants were paid. In occupied territories across Europe, ordinary civilians, sometimes desperate for money themselves, sometimes simply loyal to the regime, turned in Jewish neighbors in exchange for a bounty, sometimes as small as a few pounds of sugar or a modest cash reward. Professional bounty hunters, especially in occupied France and the Netherlands, made a business out of finding people in hiding. Being discovered with hidden wealth often did more than cost a family money. In plenty of cases, it was the evidence that got them deported in the first place, because a family with nothing looked less worth searching than a family that clearly had something to protect. This means the smartest hiding places were never the ones people found admirable decades later. They were the ones so mundane, so beneath notice, that a search team wouldn't waste the extra 10 minutes looking for them. The jam jar worked precisely because nobody suspects a jam jar. There's one more category of hidden wealth that's still unresolved today, and it involves art. Jewish collectors across occupied Europe owned significant private art collections, and the Nazi regime looted them systematically, sometimes through direct confiscation, sometimes through forced sales at prices set by the very people doing the confiscating. Some families, seeing what was coming, entrusted paintings to non-Jewish friends, foreign museums, or diplomatic contacts for safekeeping, gambling that a canvas hidden behind a false wall or shipped abroad under someone else's name might survive the war, even if the family didn't. Many of those paintings resurface decades later in museums, private collections, and auction houses, with ownership histories that quietly skipped the 1930s and 40s entirely.
International restitution efforts are still identifying looted artwork and returning it to descendants today, more than 80 years after it was taken. Some of these cases are still working through courts as you're watching this. So let's circle back to where this started, because this story actually ends somewhere. It isn't only a list of methods. The family in that opening apartment, the coin under the floorboard, the ring in the bread, the papers in the coat lining, represents thousands of real households who made the exact same calculations in the exact same 90 seconds all across occupied Europe. Some of those families survived the war and came back for what they'd hidden. A devastating number did not, and what they hid outlived them by decades, sometimes surfacing in a Swiss vault, sometimes in a floorboard during a home renovation 70 years later, sometimes never surfacing at all. This is the part that should sit with you longer than the tricks themselves. Every method in this video, the false bottom, the trusted friend holding your property, the account across a border no one can reach, exists because someone was told with total certainty that a knock on the door might be the last conversation they ever had. None of this is really about outsmarting a system. It's about what an entire population was forced to become overnight, just to have a chance at surviving what their own neighbors, laws, and government had turned into a machine built to take everything from them, including, in the end, far too many of their lives. So the next time you tuck something away that isn't anyone else's business, a drawer, an account, a small private thing you're keeping to yourself, it's worth remembering where that instinct actually comes from and what it cost the people who needed it most.